Oh, ChatGPT Ds. The ceremony was at its peak. Glittering lights, dresses shining under the spotlights, stars carefully placed in their seats. The Dolby Theater breathed that forced prestige and fake lightness that only the Oscars can conjure. Chris Rock, seasoned, sharp, a familiar face to the show, took the stage. Black suit, the smile of someone who knows how to play to the crowd, and a confidence carved by years of pressure-cooked comedy. He had minutes. It only took seconds. The joke was quick. A comment about Jada Pinkett Smith's look, comparing her to the character from G.I. Jane. Light, in the tradition of the Hollywood roast. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't new. But it hit like dynamite in an already mined field. Chris first saw Will Smith laugh. Then, the sudden cut of that smile. As if something inside him had flipped a rage switch. He stood, walked with an unsettling calm up to the stage. The slap was sharp. The sound echoed louder than any applause that night. Chris staggered, barely, just a millimeter. With one hand on his hip, he looked out at the audience, then at Will, who was already returning to his seat, and said with a trembling voice, not from fear, but from stunned restraint, "Will Smith just slapped the SH*T out of me." Silence fell over the theater like a heavy fog. There was no soundtrack, no laughter, just eyes, all of them, trying to figure out if this was part of the show. It wasn't. Will shouted, twice, words laced with fury. "Keep my wife's name out your ing mouth." Chris took a deep breath, smiled, a disoriented smile. He had thousands of eyes on him, millions through the cameras. He could have clapped back with sarcasm, could have struck back. But he chose the harder path, to continue. That was the greatest night in the history of television. And he went on. That night, Chris Rock didn't return the slap. At least, not there. The whole world saw his face turn, but few noticed the strength of the man who didn't hit back. His silence wasn't cowardice. It was ammunition. Backstage, as the cameras turned off and social masks were put back on, Chris sat alone in his dressing room. Seated, his face still burning. Not from the slap, but from public humiliation. There was something burning inside him. It wasn't anger. It was something heavier. A quiet will to wait, watch, and at the right moment respond. With words. The world exploded with opinions. The morning after the Oscars, newspapers weren't talking about the winners, the emotional speeches, or the boldest red carpet looks. They were talking about a slap, a single gesture that traveled the globe in seconds and split opinions like a razor. But at the center of a storm, Chris Rock remained silent. He didn't give interviews. He didn't post anything. No statements on social media, no official press releases, no planned appearances. He disappeared, or rather, he stayed quiet, and being quiet in a world that demands instant reaction is a powerful form of presence. His phone rang nonstop. Agents, friends, talk show hosts looking for exclusives, producers offering millions for him to tell his side. Everyone waited for his response. But Chris knew, if it came in the heat of anger, it would just be another mistake in a sea of them. He chose to wait. 4 days, he observed. He read. He watched. He heard people call him weak for not reacting. Others praised him for his restraint. And among those voices, a truth grew inside him. Revenge, when served cold, is sharper. But when served with intelligence, it's undeniable. Chris began to write. Alone, in his notebook, far from the cameras. Each line was a step toward taking back control of the narrative. He didn't just want to respond to Will Smith. He wanted to understand what that slap really meant. It wasn't just about him. It was about fame, masculinity, pain, exposure. It was about being a black man in a world that demands strength at all times, even when the right kind of strength is restrained. Meanwhile, Will Smith went through the public stages of regret, an apology on Instagram, a softly lit, meditative video, a carefully managed redemption campaign. But Chris didn't respond. He didn't accept. He didn't reject. He didn't provoke. And that lack of reaction became a reaction in itself. With every passing day of silence, he regained power. The audience was still listening, even though he wasn't saying a word. They were waiting, and he knew he would only get one shot, one single chance to take the stage and say everything. And when that happened, it had to be unforgettable. Because for a comedian, the stage is courtroom. confessional, and battlefield. And Chris Rock was preparing for his trial. A year had passed. For the public, time seemed to have softened the impact of the slap. But for Chris, time was a silent furnace. Each day added more pressure, more expectation, more unanswered questions. And he knew he couldn't just step onto any stage on any night and simply talk about the slap. No, the response needed structure, rhythm, timing. Like a great stand-up set, it had to be crafted. It wouldn't just be revenge, it would be stylized justice. A masterclass on how to respond to violence, without shouting, without desperation. With precision, with intelligence, with brutal elegance. The special was announced with an unprecedented detail. It would be live. Netflix would broadcast selective outrage in real time. No cuts, no edits, no second take. It was a risky move, and Chris wanted it that way. Like a boxer stepping into the ring without padding. He wanted the world to see him raw, present, owning his pain, and laughing at it. On the night of his special, the theater was packed. Celebrities in the audience, fans around the world glued to their screens. Everyone knew that at some point, Chris would talk about the slap, but no one knew when. He gave no hints, no previews, and then it began. For an hour, Chris delivered everything. Razor-sharp jokes, social critiques, cultural observations, political jabs, takedowns of modern hypocrisy. He seemed to be having fun, as if the world had forgotten what it came for. And then, like a master of tension, he shifted the tone. The audience held its breath. Chris, now serious, looked directly into the camera. His voice didn't shake. His pace didn't quicken. There was no rage, no yelling, just control. Everybody asked me, "Why didn't you fight back?" I'll tell you why. Because I was raised by parents who taught me, don't fight in front of white people. The crowd laughed, but it wasn't easy laughter. It was nervous, uncomfortable. Chris was opening a wound bigger than the slap. He was talking about centuries of expectations around dignity and self-restraint. He was saying that not hitting back, in that moment, was an act of resistance. And then he went deeper. He spoke about Will, about how he had been publicly humiliated, not by Chris, but by his own wife, on a show where she admitted to an affair with Will sitting beside her, powerless in front of the cameras. He talked about how the world mocked him and how, deep down, Will wasn't angry at Chris, but at the broken mirror of his own life. He practiced selective outrage. He hit me because he knew he could. He didn't hit that guy he lost respect for. He hit the guy who always admired him. Silence. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Chris didn't need to raise his voice. Each word was an obsidian blade, dark, sharp, uncompromising. And then, with the mastery of someone who knows exactly when to end a set, he smiled and said, "I took that slap, like a man, and now I've returned it, without laying a finger." The audience erupted. In applause, in laughter, in cathartic relief. Chris Rock left the stage with his head held high, not as the Oscar victim, but as the artist who turned an act of violence into art. As the man who proved that words, when chosen well, can wound and heal more than any hand ever could. What Chris Rock did that night wasn't just stand-up. It was dissection. Word by word, laugh by laugh, he opened up a body, the public body of Will Smith, and examined it in front of everyone. But not with mockery, with surgical coldness. Each sentence was more than a joke. It was analysis, social critique, a raw exposure of the emotional gears that make us explode at the wrong moments at the wrong people. Chris didn't have to make anything up. He used the facts. She heard him way more than I ever could. She interviewed him, in front of the world, about the affair. He was sitting there, with tears in his eyes. And I thought, why are you doing this, man? Because you're more famous than me. The audience laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. This was more than humor. It was the deconstruction of an idol. Chris was exposing the truth beneath the glitter of celebrity. Fame protects no one from pain, humiliation, or pent-up anger. And when that anger goes unresolved, it erupts. In public, in destructive ways. Chris continued. Everyone said, "He's bigger than you, he could beat you up." Yeah, but why did he choose to do that to me? Because he knew I wouldn't do anything. Because he knew I was small, that I wasn't a threat. That's what it was, selective outrage. That phrase, selective outrage, became a mantra. It went viral. It became the central thesis of the special. The title phrase, and it captured everything. The idea that, so often, people don't lash out at those who hurt them, they lash out at whoever's nearby and poses no real threat. Chris wasn't just trying to expose Will Smith. He wanted to expose the pattern. The cowardice behind acts that seem impulsive. The injustice of hitting someone weaker just because you can. And still, he did it with class. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He didn't stumble over his emotions. He laughed. He made others laugh. He conducted pain like a maestro with his orchestra. There was no bitterness, only control. I was a fan of Will Smith my whole life. I loved that guy. Saw all his movies. Now, I watch Emancipation just to see him get hooped. The audience erupted in laughter. And there it was, the turn. Chris showed that he was no longer beneath Will. He was above him. Because while Will lost control, Chris mastered both his narrative and Will's. It was a slap without sound, but one that echoed much longer. After the show, there was no doubt Chris Rock had won. And not out of revenge, but because he did what few can, turned pain into performance, humiliation into spectacle, trauma into power. When the stage lights went dark that night, Chris Rock walked away alone. No security, no fuss, just him, his dark suit, and an inner silence that, for the first time in a long time, was peace. He didn't need to hear the criticism, didn't need to read the headlines. He knew, by the sound of the audience, the chill down his arms, the cold sweat finally evaporating, that he had nailed it. Not just the joke, but the point. The next day, social media was ablaze. Culture sites, serious newspapers, influencers, academics. Everyone was talking about him. The special, the speech, the response. Chris Rock gave a masterclass. The slap came back, and it came back as art. Silence is consent. Patience is victory. But Chris didn't want to be a hero, didn't want medals, or to play the martyr. He wanted, and achieved, something rarer, to be truly heard. Behind the fame, he knew something had shifted. Those who once saw him as weak now saw self-control. Those who called him a coward now applauded him as a master. And those who expected blood saw a man turn public humiliation into personal performance. Without stooping, without yelling, without lying. The industry noticed too. Interview invites, special awards, documentaries about his career, tributes. But he turned most down. He preferred the stage, the microphone, the dark audience. Because there, and only there, he could say it all without apologies. Chris knew he would never erase what happened that Oscar night. The slap would be part of his biography, like a visible scar. But now, he had inked it with something greater, response. And maybe that was the hardest blow of all. Not the physical slap, but what came after. What remained. What taught. The difference between reacting on impulse and reacting with purpose. Will Smith apologized. Publicly. In videos, statements, interviews. But the image was marked. Not as a villain, but as someone who lost control in front of a man who didn't. Chris, for his part, asked for nothing. He just spoke. And in the end, that was his true victory. He didn't want to be an example. But he became one. Not for those who want to get even, but for those who understand that not every blow needs a fist. Some, the deepest ones, come with words. And they make more noise in the silence than 1,000 slaps under applause.